In the tumultuous aftermath of World War I, as Germany struggled with economic collapse, political upheaval, and social transformation, a monster emerged from the shadows of Hanover who would forever change the landscape of criminal investigation and forensic science. Fritz Haarmann, who became infamously known as Der Schlachter von Hanover, the Butcher of Hanover, embarked on a killing spree between 1918 and 1924 that claimed the lives of at least 27 young men and boys, though the actual number may have been significantly higher. Friedrich Heinrich Karl Haarmann was born on October 25, 1879, in Hanover, then part of the German Empire, into a working-class family that would prove to be deeply dysfunctional. His father, Al Haarmann, was a locomotive stoker known for his violent temper and authoritarian parenting style, while his mother, Johanna, was described as a weak-willed woman who oscillated between overprotecting Fritz and completely neglecting him. The Haarmann household was characterized by extreme dysfunction that would profoundly shape Fritz's psychological development. His father's violent outbursts and rigid authoritarianism created an atmosphere of fear and unpredictability, while his mother's inconsistent parenting failed to provide the emotional stability necessary for healthy psychological development. This toxic family environment would later be identified by criminal psychologists as a crucial factor in his transformation into a serial killer. From his earliest years, Fritz displayed behavioral patterns that modern psychology would recognize as significant warning signs. He showed little interest in typical masculine activities preferred by his father, instead gravitating toward what were then considered feminine pursuits such as playing with dolls and dressing in girls' clothing. These behaviors enraged his authoritarian father, leading to severe physical punishment that only served to deepen the psychological wounds. At school, Fritz was noted for his poor academic performance and increasingly antisocial behavior. Teachers described him as a strange, withdrawn child who seemed to inhabit his own internal world. He displayed cruelty toward animals, engaged in persistent lying, and showed an early fascination with violence and death that alarmed those around him. These early behavioral indicators, now recognized as the McDonald triad of childhood psychopathy, went unaddressed in the less psychologically sophisticated society of late 19th century Germany. The family's financial struggles added another layer of stress to an already volatile household. Al Haarmann's income as a locomotive stoker was barely sufficient to support the family, and periods of unemployment created additional tension and violence in the home. Fritz witnessed frequent arguments about money and observed how economic desperation could drive people to desperate measures, lessons that would later influence his criminal methodology. As Fritz entered adolescence, his psychological problems became more pronounced. He began to display what would now be recognized as symptoms of emerging personality disorders, including a complete inability to form genuine emotional connections with others, a grandiose sense of self-importance, and an increasing comfort with deception and manipulation. These traits, combined with his traumatic childhood experiences, created the psychological foundation for his later criminal career. Fritz's teenage years were marked by escalating behavioral problems that brought him into increasing conflict with both his family and society. His sexual identity began to emerge during this period, and in the repressive social climate of Imperial Germany, his homosexual inclinations created additional psychological stress and social rejection that further contributed to his antisocial development. At age 16, Fritz was arrested for the first time on charges related to sexual misconduct with younger boys. This incident brought shame upon his family and resulted in his father attempting to have him committed to a mental institution. The psychiatric evaluation conducted at this time noted his moral insanity and recommended institutionalization, but Fritz managed to avoid long-term commitment through a combination of manipulation and a limited understanding of mental illness prevalent at the time. His relationship with his father deteriorated completely following this scandal, with Al Haarmann disowning his son and forbidding him from returning to the family home. This rejection, while perhaps understandable given the social attitudes of the time, served to further destabilize Fritz's already fragmented psychological state and removed what little family support structure remained. Homeless and rejected by his family, Fritz was forced to survive on the streets of Hanover, where he quickly learned that his survival depended on his ability to manipulate and exploit others. He developed considerable skill at identifying vulnerable individuals who could be used for his own purposes, whether for sexual gratification, financial gain, or simply as targets for his growing violent impulses. During this period, Fritz also began to develop the skills and connections that would later prove crucial to his criminal career. He learned to forge documents, developed relationships with corrupt officials, and became familiar with the underground economy that thrived in the urban centers of Imperial Germany. These criminal skills, combined with his psychological dysfunction, were creating a dangerous individual capable of extraordinary harm. His military service, which began in 1895, provided temporary structure but also exposed him to institutional violence and gave him access to weapons and training that would later enhance his killing capabilities. Military records describe him as an unreliable soldier who was frequently disciplined for various infractions, though his criminal activities during this period were relatively minor compared to what would come later. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 provided Fritz Haarmann with opportunities to exploit the chaos and social disruption that characterized wartime Germany. While he was too old for frontline military service, the war created conditions that allowed him to engage in black market activities and other illegal enterprises with reduced risk of detection or prosecution. The war years saw Fritz developing a more sophisticated criminal operation, primarily focused on smuggling and black market trading. He established connections with corrupt officials, developed expertise in forged documents, and learned to exploit the desperation of civilians struggling with wartime shortages. These activities provided him with both financial resources and the organizational skills that would later prove crucial to his killing spree. More importantly, the massive social disruption caused by the war created an environment in which people could disappear without raising immediate suspicion. Families were separated, communication networks were disrupted, and authorities were overwhelmed with more pressing concerns than investigating missing persons cases. These conditions would later provide perfect cover for Fritz's murderous activities. The psychological impact of the war also contributed to Fritz's criminal development. The normalization of violence, the devaluation of human life, and the breakdown of traditional social structures created an environment in which extreme behavior became more acceptable. Fritz, already predisposed to violence and lacking normal moral constraints, found these conditions conducive to the expression of his darkest impulses. Germany's defeat in 1918 and the subsequent economic collapse created even more favorable conditions for Fritz's criminal activities. The post-war period was characterized by hyperinflation, mass unemployment, political instability, and social upheaval that made law enforcement ineffective and created large populations of vulnerable individuals who could be easily exploited. The establishment of the Weimar Republic brought political freedom but also economic chaos that Fritz learned to exploit. He established himself as a black market operator and informant for the police, a dual role that provided him with both criminal opportunities and protection from prosecution. This relationship with law enforcement would prove crucial in allowing his killing spree to continue undetected for so long. Fritz Haarmann's transformation from petty criminal to serial killer appears to have begun around 1918, coinciding with Germany's defeat and the beginning of the economic and social chaos that characterized the early Weimar period. His first confirmed murder victim was a young man named Friedel Roth, though investigators later suspected that there may have been earlier victims whose disappearances were attributed to the war. The murder of Friedel Roth established the pattern that would characterize all of Fritz's subsequent crimes. The victim was a vulnerable young man from a poor background who had come to Hanover seeking employment opportunities. Fritz approached him with offers of help and shelter, gaining his trust before luring him to his apartment where the murder took place. What distinguished Fritz's crimes from those of many other serial killers was the methodical way in which he disposed of his victims' bodies. Rather than simply hiding the corpses, he systematically butchered them, selling the meat in his small shop as pork or beef to unsuspecting customers. This macabre business model allowed him to profit from his murders while also eliminating evidence of his crimes. The post-war food shortages in Germany made Fritz's meat sales particularly profitable and unlikely to attract suspicion. Desperate civilians were grateful for any source of protein and were not inclined to ask too many questions about its origin. This economic desperation provided perfect cover for Fritz's ghoulish enterprise. His apartment, located at 27 Sellerstrasse, became a charnel house where young men were lured, murdered, and systematically dismembered. Fritz had converted part of the space into a primitive butcher shop where he processed his victims' remains with the same efficiency he had learned in legitimate meat processing work. The systematic nature of these operations demonstrated a level of planning and organization that made his crimes particularly horrifying. The psychological satisfaction Fritz derived from his murders appeared to go beyond simple sexual gratification or financial gain. Criminal psychologists who later studied his case identified clear signs of necrophilia and cannibalism, suggesting that his crimes fulfilled deep-seated psychological needs related to control, domination, and consumption of his victims. As the 1920s progressed, Fritz Haarmann's killing spree intensified dramatically. What had begun as isolated murders became a systematic operation that claimed victims on an almost regular basis. His target demographic remained consistent: young men and boys, typically between the ages of 12 and 20, who were economically desperate and socially isolated. Fritz's hunting ground was primarily Hanover's main railway station, where he would encounter runaway boys, unemployed young men, and other vulnerable individuals seeking opportunities in the city. He presented himself as a helpful benefactor who could provide employment, shelter, and protection to those in need. His ability to identify and exploit vulnerability made him extraordinarily effective as a predator. The economic chaos of the early Weimar Republic provided Fritz with an endless supply of potential victims. Hyperinflation had destroyed the savings of middle-class families, unemployment was rampant, and social services were virtually non-existent. Young men who might previously have found legitimate employment or family support were now forced to fend for themselves in an increasingly hostile environment. Fritz's method of operation became increasingly sophisticated during this period. He developed a network of contacts who would alert him to the arrival of particularly vulnerable young men, and he perfected his techniques for gaining their trust and luring them to his apartment. His experience as a police informant had taught him how to avoid suspicion and work within the system rather than against it. The disposal of his victims' remains became an efficient industrial process. Fritz had established relationships with local butchers and meat vendors who unknowingly helped him distribute human flesh throughout Hanover's food supply. The systematic nature of this operation was particularly horrifying, as it meant that many of the city's residents had unknowingly consumed the remains of his victims. During this period, Fritz also began to take trophies from his victims, keeping personal belongings, clothing, and in some cases body parts as mementos of his crimes. These trophies served both psychological and practical purposes, providing him with satisfaction while also potentially serving as evidence that could be used to blackmail or manipulate others. One of the most disturbing aspects of Fritz Haarmann's case was his relationship with Hans Granz, a younger man who became his accomplice and lover. Granz, who was in his early 20s when he became involved with Fritz, played a crucial role in the selection of victims and the operation of the murder business. Hans Granz represented a different type of criminal personality than Fritz. While Fritz was driven by deep-seated psychological compulsions and violent impulses, Granz appeared to be motivated primarily by greed and a desire for material comfort. He was attracted to the lifestyle that Fritz's criminal activities provided, including fine clothes, good food, and a comfortable apartment. The relationship between Fritz and Granz was complex and reflected the power dynamics that often characterize criminal partnerships. Fritz was clearly the dominant partner, making the ultimate decisions about which victims to target and how to dispose of their remains. However, Granz played an important role in identifying potential victims and may have influenced some of Fritz's choices. Granz's youth and conventional attractiveness made him useful as a lure for potential victims. Young men who might have been suspicious of Fritz's intentions were more likely to trust someone closer to their own age. This partnership significantly increased the efficiency of Fritz's hunting and may have contributed to the escalation in his killing frequency. The psychological dynamics of their relationship also appeared to feed into Fritz's violent impulses. Some experts have suggested that Fritz's need to impress and provide for Granz may have motivated him to kill more frequently and take greater risks. The desire to maintain their lifestyle required constant income from the sale of human flesh, creating a perpetual need for new victims. Their relationship was also marked by jealousy and possessiveness that may have influenced victim selection. Several of Fritz's victims were young men whom Granz had shown interest in, suggesting that jealousy may have been a factor in some of the murders. This personal element added another layer of horror to crimes that were already extraordinarily brutal. One of the most shocking aspects of the Fritz Haarmann case was the extent to which police corruption and systemic failures allowed his crimes to continue unchecked for years. Fritz had established himself as a valuable police informant, providing information about black market activities and other criminal enterprises in exchange for protection and preferential treatment. This relationship with law enforcement gave Fritz virtual immunity from serious investigation, even when evidence of his crimes began to accumulate. Police officers who might otherwise have investigated suspicious activities at his apartment were instead protecting him as a valuable asset in their efforts to combat other forms of crime. The corruption extended beyond simple protection arrangements to active participation in Fritz's criminal enterprises. Some police officers were reportedly customers for his black market meat sales, unknowingly consuming the flesh of his victims while simultaneously protecting the man who had killed them. This grotesque irony highlighted the complete breakdown of law enforcement integrity in post-war Hanover. The social and economic chaos of the Weimar period had created an environment in which police corruption flourished. Officers who were struggling to feed their families on inadequate salaries were easily tempted by the financial opportunities that cooperation with criminals like Fritz provided. This corruption created a vicious cycle in which law enforcement became complicit in the crimes they were supposed to prevent. The missing persons reports that should have triggered investigations into Fritz's activities were routinely ignored or dismissed by corrupt officers who had incentives to avoid looking too closely at their informants' activities. Families searching for missing sons were told that their loved ones had probably left town seeking employment opportunities, a plausible explanation in the context of Germany's economic crisis. This systematic failure of law enforcement allowed Fritz to operate with impunity for years, claiming dozens of victims who might have been saved if police had fulfilled their basic responsibilities. The case became a landmark example of how institutional corruption can enable the worst forms of criminal behavior. Despite the protection afforded by police corruption, Fritz Haarmann's crimes began to attract attention from various quarters as the body count mounted and evidence accumulated. Neighbors in his apartment building reported strange smells and sounds coming from his flat, while local residents began to notice the unusual quantity and quality of meat being sold from his small shop. The first serious investigation into Fritz's activities came not from the police, but from private citizens who had grown suspicious of his behavior. Parents of missing boys began to compare notes and noticed that several of their sons had last been seen in Fritz's company. These informal investigations began to create pressure for official action. Local newspapers also began to take notice of the high number of missing young men in Hanover, though they were initially cautious about directly accusing Fritz given his connections to law enforcement. However, journalistic investigation began to uncover patterns that suggested something more sinister than simple disappearances was occurring. The discovery of human bones in the river Lane near Hanover in the spring of 1924 marked the beginning of the end for Fritz's killing spree. While individual bones might have been dismissed as ancient remains or isolated incidents, the quantity and condition of the bones suggested systematic disposal of human remains on a large scale. Pressure from the public and media eventually forced even the corrupt police department to take action. The appointment of new investigators who were not part of Fritz's protection network led to a more serious examination of the evidence against him. These investigators quickly identified him as the primary suspect in the disappearances. The investigation revealed the shocking extent of Fritz's crimes and the systematic failure of law enforcement to protect the public. Evidence that had been ignored or suppressed for years suddenly came to light, painting a horrifying picture of institutional complicity in mass murder. Fritz Haarmann's arrest on June 22, 1924, came about almost by accident when police conducting a routine check discovered him in a compromising situation with a young man who appeared to be underage. While this incident was relatively minor compared to his murder activities, it provided investigators with the opportunity they needed to search his apartment and gather evidence of his more serious crimes. The search of Fritz's apartment at 27 Sellerstrasse revealed a scene that shocked even experienced investigators. The flat contained evidence of systematic butchery, including specialized knives, meat processing equipment, and human remains in various stages of preparation. Personal belongings of numerous victims were found throughout the apartment, providing concrete evidence linking Fritz to specific disappearances. Perhaps most horrifying was the discovery of Fritz's meticulous record-keeping, which documented many of his crimes in disturbing detail. These records revealed not only the scope of his killing spree but also the calculating nature of his approach to murder and disposal. The systematic documentation suggested a level of organization that made his crimes particularly chilling. The interrogation that followed Fritz's arrest gradually revealed the full extent of his criminal activities. Initially defiant and uncooperative, he eventually began to confess to his crimes, providing details that only the perpetrator could have known. His confessions painted a picture of systematic violence that far exceeded investigators' worst expectations. Fritz's confessions were notable for their matter-of-fact tone and complete absence of remorse. He described his murders in clinical detail, explaining his methods for selecting victims, the techniques he used to kill them, and the process he employed to dispose of their remains. This lack of emotional response to his own admissions of mass murder provided disturbing insights into his psychological state. The investigation also revealed the extent of police corruption that had enabled Fritz's crimes. Several officers were suspended or dismissed when their protective relationship with Fritz became known, though the full extent of institutional complicity was never completely exposed due to efforts to protect the reputation of law enforcement. Fritz Haarmann's trial began on December 4, 1924, in Hanover and immediately became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in German history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who were fascinated and horrified by the details of his crimes that emerged during testimony. The prosecution's case was built on a combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and Fritz's own confessions. The evidence was overwhelming, including personal belongings of victims found in his apartment, testimony from survivors who had escaped his clutches, and forensic evidence linking him to the disposal of human remains in the river Lane. Fritz's behavior during the trial alternated between attempts to appear remorseful and outbursts of anger when he felt his intelligence was being questioned. He seemed more concerned with how he was being portrayed in the media than with the legal consequences of his actions, displaying the narcissistic traits that had characterized his criminal career. The testimony provided during the trial revealed new details about Fritz's crimes that had not emerged during his initial confessions. Witnesses described his systematic approach to victim selection, his methods for gaining trust, and the horrifying efficiency with which he operated his murder business. These revelations further shocked a public that thought they had already heard the worst. Hans Granz was tried as an accomplice, though his role in the murders remained somewhat ambiguous. While clearly involved in the selection of victims and the operation of the criminal enterprise, the extent of his direct participation in the murders themselves was disputed. His trial provided additional insights into the partnership that had enabled Fritz's killing spree. The media coverage of the trial was unprecedented for its time, with newspapers throughout Germany and Europe providing daily updates on the proceedings. The case became an international sensation, with journalists from around the world traveling to Hanover to cover what was being called the trial of the century. The Fritz Haarmann trial featured some of the most advanced psychological and psychiatric testimony available in 1924, as experts attempted to understand the mind of one of history's most prolific serial killers. Dr. Theodor Lessing, a prominent psychiatrist, conducted extensive evaluations of Fritz and provided testimony that would influence the understanding of serial killer psychology for decades to come. Dr. Lessing's analysis identified Fritz as suffering from what would now be recognized as multiple personality disorders, including psychopathy, narcissistic personality disorder, and possible paranoid schizophrenia. The evaluation revealed a complete absence of empathy, an inability to form genuine emotional connections, and a grandiose sense of self-importance that allowed him to view other human beings as objects for his use. The psychological profile that emerged during the trial painted Fritz as a classic example of what would later be termed a organized serial killer, someone who carefully planned his crimes, maintained a facade of normalcy, and operated according to systematic patterns. This organized approach distinguished him from disorganized killers who act impulsively and leave more obvious evidence. Expert testimony also explored the role of Fritz's childhood trauma and sexual identity in shaping his criminal behavior. The combination of physical abuse, emotional neglect, and social rejection related to his homosexuality were identified as contributing factors that had created the psychological conditions necessary for his violent behavior. The cannibalistic aspects of Fritz's crimes received particular attention from psychological experts, who noted that this behavior went beyond practical considerations of body disposal to fulfill deeper psychological needs. The consumption of his victims represented the ultimate form of domination and control, allowing Fritz to literally incorporate his victims into himself. The trial also featured testimony about the social and economic conditions that had enabled Fritz's crimes. Experts noted how the chaos of post-war Germany had created an environment in which vulnerable populations were easily exploited and in which normal social controls had broken down sufficiently to allow extreme criminal behavior to flourish. On December 19, 1924, after just 2 weeks of testimony, the court found Fritz Haarmann guilty of 24 counts of murder, though he was suspected of many more, and sentenced him to death by beheading. The verdict was met with approval from the packed courtroom and reflected the public's desire for ultimate justice in response to his horrific crimes. Fritz's reaction to the death sentence was characteristically narcissistic and self-serving. Rather than expressing remorse for his crimes or sympathy for his victims' families, he complained about the unfairness of his treatment and seemed primarily concerned with how his execution would be carried out. He requested that his head be used for scientific research, viewing this as a way to achieve a form of immortality. Hans Granz received a sentence of life imprisonment for his role as an accomplice, though he was released after serving only 12 years. The disparity in sentences reflected the court's view that while Granz had been complicit in the crimes, Fritz had been the primary instigator and perpetrator of the murders. The period between sentencing and execution was marked by Fritz's continued attempts to manipulate public opinion and gain sympathy for his situation. He gave numerous interviews to journalists, always portraying himself as a victim of circumstances rather than acknowledging responsibility for his actions. Fritz Haarmann was executed by guillotine on April 15, 1925, in the courtyard of Hanover prison. His execution was attended by a small group of officials and observers, though public interest in the event was enormous. Contemporary accounts describe his final moments as displaying the same lack of genuine remorse that had characterized his behavior throughout the trial. The execution of Fritz Haarmann brought a measure of closure to one of Germany's most horrific criminal cases, though questions about how his crimes have been allowed to continue for so long continue to haunt German society. His death marked the end of an individual monster but also highlighted broader systemic failures that had enabled his crimes. The Fritz Haarmann case had profound and lasting impacts on German criminal justice, forensic science, and police procedures. The systematic failures that had allowed his crimes to continue unchecked led to significant reforms in how serial crimes were investigated and how police informants were managed. One of the most important changes was the establishment of better oversight mechanisms for police-informant relationships. The case had demonstrated how these relationships could be corrupted to protect criminals rather than assist in law enforcement, leading to new protocols designed to prevent similar abuses. The investigation also led to advances in forensic science, particularly in the identification of human remains and the analysis of physical evidence. The techniques developed during the Haarmann investigation influenced forensic practices throughout Germany and beyond, contributing to the development of modern criminal investigation methods. Police training programs were substantially upgraded to include education about serial crime patterns and the psychological factors that drive such behavior. The Haarmann case became a standard study in police academies, providing future investigators with insights into how organized killers operate and how they can be detected and apprehended. The case also influenced legal reforms related to the protection of vulnerable populations, particularly homeless youth and economically disadvantaged individuals who had been Fritz's primary targets. New social services were developed to provide support for at-risk populations and reduce their vulnerability to predators. International cooperation in criminal investigation was also enhanced as a result of lessons learned from the case. The realization that criminals like Fritz could exploit jurisdictional boundaries and institutional weaknesses led to better communication and coordination between different law enforcement agencies. The Fritz Haarmann case had enormous cultural impact in Germany and throughout Europe, influencing literature, film, theater, and popular culture for decades to come. The case became a symbol of the social chaos and moral breakdown that characterized the Weimar period, serving as a metaphor for broader social concerns. German playwright George Kaiser wrote a play based on the case, while numerous novels and films drew inspiration from Fritz's crimes. These cultural works helped process the social trauma created by his crimes while also contributing to public understanding of the psychological factors that drive serial killing behavior. The case also influenced public discourse about homosexuality, mental illness, and criminal responsibility. Fritz's sexual orientation became a focal point for debates about the relationship between sexual deviance and violent behavior, though these discussions often reflected the prejudices of the era rather than scientific understanding. The media coverage of the case established new standards for crime reporting and helped create the modern concept of the celebrity criminal. Fritz became one of the first serial killers to achieve international notoriety, setting precedents for how such cases would be covered by the press in the future. The case also contributed to broader discussions about the social conditions that enable criminal behavior. Fritz's crimes were seen as a product of the economic and social chaos of post-war Germany, leading to calls for better social services and economic policies designed to reduce the vulnerability of at-risk populations. The psychological insights gained from studying Fritz's case influenced the development of criminal psychology as a discipline. His crimes provided early insights into the minds of serial killers that would inform research and treatment approaches for decades to come. The Fritz Haarmann case must be understood within the broader historical context of Germany's turbulent transition from imperial monarchy to democratic republic following World War I. The social, economic, and political chaos of this period created conditions that were particularly conducive to the emergence of extreme criminal behavior. The collapse of traditional social structures following Germany's defeat in 1918 created a vacuum that was filled by criminal organizations, corrupt officials, and predators like Fritz who were able to exploit the weakness of institutional controls. The case illustrated how quickly civilized society could break down when basic social services and law enforcement systems failed. The economic hyperinflation of the early 1920s created mass desperation that Fritz exploited to find victims and customers for his ghoulish business. Young men who might previously have found legitimate employment were forced into vulnerable situations where they could be easily targeted by predators. The case also reflected broader changes in German society's relationship with authority and traditional values. The breakdown of respect for traditional institutions created an environment in which extreme behavior became more acceptable and in which normal social controls were less effective. From a criminological perspective, the Haarmann case represented one of the first systematic studies of serial killer behavior and provided insights that would influence criminal investigation techniques for decades. The case helped establish the concept of criminal profiling and contributed to understanding of how organized killers operate. The international attention generated by the case also contributed to the development of comparative criminology and cross-cultural studies of criminal behavior. Fritz's crimes were compared to similar cases in other countries, leading to greater understanding of the universal factors that contribute to serial killing behavior. More than a century after his execution, Fritz Haarmann remains a significant figure in the study of criminal behavior and the development of forensic science. His case continues to be studied in criminology and psychology programs worldwide as an example of how individual psychological dysfunction can interact with social conditions to create extraordinarily dangerous predators. The investigative techniques developed during the Haarmann case laid important groundwork for modern serial crime investigation. The systematic analysis of crime scenes, the careful documentation of physical evidence, and the coordination between different investigative agencies established precedents that continue to influence law enforcement practices today. The psychological insights gained from studying Fritz's case contributed to the development of modern understanding of psychopathy and antisocial personality disorders. His case provided early evidence for the importance of childhood trauma in the development of violent behavior and helped establish the field of criminal psychology as a legitimate scientific discipline. The case also continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of police corruption and institutional failure. The systematic breakdown of law enforcement integrity that enabled Fritz's crimes provides lessons that remain relevant for modern criminal justice systems. Educational institutions throughout the world continue to use the Haarmann case as a teaching tool in criminology, psychology, and law enforcement programs. His crimes serve as a practical example of how theoretical concepts about criminal behavior apply in real-world situations. The case has also influenced popular culture, inspiring numerous books, films, and television programs that explore both his crimes and their broader social context. These cultural works help maintain public awareness of the lessons learned from his case while also serving as entertainment. The Fritz Haarmann case provides an interesting point of comparison with other serial killers of his era and helps illuminate both universal and culture-specific factors that contribute to such extreme criminal behavior. His systematic approach and business model distinguished him from many contemporary killers who operated more impulsively. Unlike many serial killers who are eventually caught due to their increasing recklessness or psychological deterioration, Fritz maintained his methodical approach throughout his criminal career. His downfall came not from mistakes in his murder methodology but from the eventual breakdown of the corrupt system that had protected him. The cannibalistic aspects of his crimes were unusual even among serial killers of his era, suggesting psychological needs that went beyond simple murder or sexual gratification. This behavior linked him to other rare cases of criminal cannibalism while highlighting the particular extremes to which his psychological dysfunction had progressed. His use of an accomplice was also relatively uncommon among serial killers, though the relationship with Hans Granz provided insights into how criminal partnerships develop and function. The dynamics of their relationship illustrated how different personality types can combine to create particularly dangerous criminal enterprises. The economic motivation behind Fritz's crimes was also distinctive, as most serial killers are driven primarily by psychological compulsions rather than financial gain. His ability to profit from his murders by selling human flesh demonstrated a level of practical thinking that was unusual among killers driven by psychological needs. The story of Fritz Haarmann represents more than just the chronicle of a serial killer's crimes. It serves as a window into a particular historical moment when social, economic, and political upheaval created conditions that allowed extraordinary evil to flourish unchecked for years. His case demonstrates how individual psychological dysfunction can interact with broader social problems to create predators capable of unimaginable harm. The combination of his traumatic childhood, emerging personality disorders, and the social chaos of post-war Germany created perfect conditions for the development of one of history's most prolific serial killers. The systematic failure of law enforcement that enabled Fritz's crimes provides crucial lessons about the importance of institutional integrity and the dangers of corruption. His case illustrates how the breakdown of normal social controls can allow the worst forms of human behavior to emerge and flourish. From a psychological perspective, Fritz's case continues to provide insights into the development and operation of serial killers. His methodical approach, complete lack of empathy, and ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while committing horrific crimes offer important lessons for those studying criminal behavior. The broader social impact of his crimes extended far beyond his individual victims to encompass entire communities and institutions that were forced to confront their own failures and vulnerabilities. His case became a catalyst for reforms that improved criminal justice systems and better protected vulnerable populations. Today, nearly a century after his execution, Fritz Haarmann's case continues to serve as both a cautionary tale and a source of valuable lessons for those working to understand and prevent similar crimes. His story reminds us of the constant vigilance required to protect society from those who would exploit the vulnerable and the importance of maintaining strong institutions capable of detecting and stopping such predators. The memory of his victims, young men whose lives were cut short by his violence and whose remains were desecrated for his profit, deserves to be honored through continued efforts to improve victim protection and support services. Their deaths serve as a reminder of the precious nature of human life and the importance of creating societies that value and protect all their members. In the end, Fritz Haarmann's legacy is not just about one man's descent into evil, but about society's ongoing struggle to understand, prevent, and respond to the darkest manifestations of human behavior. His case continues to inform our understanding of criminal psychology, improve our investigative techniques, and strengthen our resolve to protect the innocent from those who would do them harm.